Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here for our elected officials special call meeting to discuss House Bill 581. I'm Dr. Jackie McMorris, Cobb County Manager. I'd like to welcome all of our elected officials, of course, our Board of Commissioners, Chairwoman Cupid. There are a few housekeeping things we just want to share, and then I'm going to toss it to Ross, who then will ask Chairwoman Cupid to bring us a greeting. First thing, restrooms are in the back. There, we have waters for you. This is open dialogue, so at any point in time during the presentation, which will be brought to you by ACCG, Dante, as well as Stephen White, and Carla Jackson is also here representing the Tax Commissioner's Office. At any point in time you have a question about anything within the presentation, feel free to ask. So Ross, you want to talk a little bit about how it's going to be streamed and the protocols?
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. This is a different setup in this room today, and for those in the audience, you're going to get probably the best side of the speakers today. We apologize for that, but we are set up for a live stream because I've gotten a lot of people who've indicated they cannot be here today, and we'll be watching either the live stream or the recording. So when we get to the question and answer section, we're just going to ask you to please wait for the mic to get to you if you raise your hand, and then the first time you speak, if you can introduce yourself so we know who you are. So we'll have this program not only live streamed but on our YouTube channel following the completion today. We got the experts behind me ready to go, but I want to let Chairwoman Cupid provide our welcome this morning.
All right, good morning, everyone. It's good to see everyone here today. I'm going to stand up so I can make sure I see who may be sitting in the back of our room. And I see our tax commissioner laughing because she knows I'm going to summon her up front. I don't know why she desires that seat, but again, it's biblical when you're called up front versus being told to go back. So come on up in the spirit of the holiday. But speaking of the holiday, certainly hope that all of you are here in good spirits, and part of this meeting is an extension of that good spirit to see how we can all be best on the same page as we consider House Bill 581 and the impact that it can have in Cobb County. Our citizens voted for this during the November 5th general election. However, there are some unique implications for Cobb County since our county already does participate in a homestead exemption, and I believe some of our municipalities may as well. So just look forward to us having the same information so we can determine how we move forward together. I'm grateful to have Dr. McMorris organize this meeting, and certainly I'm grateful to have ACCG here to help explain or walk us through what this bill means and how it could impact us, along with our various members of our county attorney's office and our finance department. For all of you who are serving, thank you for being here. So with that, I'll turn things over to you.
Good morning. Stephen White from the Tax Assessor's Office. I'm the Chief Appraiser. With me today is Dante Handel from ACCG. We're very happy to be with you all again to provide you some points for consideration. In today's presentation, we have developed a few slides on the most common questions that we are getting. So we will go over those one by one. And we've also provided some new slides from, if you had the presentation that we did last time, different ways of looking at things such as timelines, things to consider, just a different avenue as we get closer to January 1 when the bill goes live. So with that, we'll kind of get into our first slide, and just kind of, again, this is the most common questions that my office, Dante, the Tax Commissioner's Office, these are some of the most common questions we are getting right now, and even in talking with some folks before the meeting, a lot of these questions that we have on here are the questions that I was getting this morning. So hopefully these will answer many of those. So as we go to the first slide, the statewide homestead float, that is the big portion of this bill. So the question, does this mean my property tax bill will only go up a small portion each year? And so I should caveat this question with, again, we have the Tax Commissioner's Office who handles billing and collection for the county. The assessor's office handles valuation. Dante's very, very familiar with the bill, and he is very prepared to answer your questions in regards to sales tax and some of the legal aspects of opting out and how that works. So we may be sharing the stage this morning depending on the question. But does this mean my property tax bill will only go up a small portion each year if your taxing authority does not opt out? So there is, of course, the opt-out provision, and that's the answer to the question. That's probably the most common question that we are getting. This one here is a close second. Does this affect my school tax exemption? No. If you have school tax exemption, this does not affect it in any way. You are school tax exempt, regardless of HB 581. How does this affect the current homestead float in Cobb County? Well, there is no effect to current floats in the float that we have in Cobb County as well as our cities, because the law allows for the jurisdictions to choose whichever one is better. And our current float that we have in Cobb County and in the cities is a total freeze on the value. So that is better for the taxpayer. So that the float program that we have for the general fund in Cobb County does not change, is not affected. All right, what does a jurisdiction need to do in order to offset any property tax loss with sales tax? This is one that Dante gets a lot, so he provided the answer to me. Intergovernmental agreement is needed, and then it would go to a referendum. And I'm sure many of you have sales tax questions and the FLOST and how that works, and we will be happy to address those in our question and answer portion. All right, why is the tax estimate on the assessment notice going away? So many jurisdictions around Georgia were having difficulties getting the estimate accurate. That is a promulgated document that you receive from my office every year, giving you the value that we have on the property. That is not a document that each county mocks up according to their needs. It is the same document county by county, and the Department of Revenue provides us with assistance in how that document should look. There is a change, as you are probably aware, and we will have a sample of what one of those will look like, we think, coming up a little bit later. The estimate is going away because many cities around Georgia have homestead floats, and many counties were having difficulties getting that float information. We didn't really have that problem here in Cobb County. We were working with many of you cities on getting your float data, and that was working quite well for us. But again, that document is a promulgated document that exists in 159 counties, and many counties were having problems. The taxpayer would get that estimate, and it would be wrong already because they don't have the float information. So that's why the estimate is going away, because many counties were having difficulties with getting accurate information on there. All right, what does each jurisdiction have to do and when? Well, here's some dates. Any opt-outs must be filed, the resolution must be filed by March 1st to the Secretary of State's office. Any opt-outs must hold 3 public hearings before March 1st. So we're kind of walking back in time a little bit. You have to have that resolution filed by March 1st, so you have to have your 3 public hearings before March 1st. Keep in mind, all jurisdictions are automatically in the program. On January 1st, each jurisdiction automatically in the program. You do not need to opt in, as it were. You're automatically in. So you need to decide if you're going to opt out before you hold those hearings. And then here's some interesting questions that we have been getting, just things for us, again, to consider. Austell is our only city in Cobb that does not have a homestead float. How are they affected? So maybe we'll let Dante kind of cover that question there.
Thanks, Steve. So, as you're saying, every jurisdiction is automatically getting this floating homestead exemption applied as of January 1st of next year, unless they opt out, which means January 1st, Austell will have a homestead float. Should the governing authority of Austell want to opt out and not participate in that program, they need to run 3 advertisements, hold 3 public hearings, and then pass a resolution affirmatively opting out, which they must file with the Secretary of State by March 1st. So it's a tight turnaround time, basically a 60-day window to get all of that done. All of those advertisements are modeled after what happens if you don't do a full rollback, so that notification of tax increase. Same rules for when you can hold those hearings and how you need to advertise them.
Go ahead, take the mail.
Sure. So the next question, Mableton does not issue a millage. How are they affected? So as of January 1st, Mableton is in the program unless Mableton opts out by March 1st. which means if they levy a millage in the future, they'll automatically have that floating homestead exemption applied to them. So every local government is automatically in the program unless they make the decision to opt out, and that's whether they levy a millage or not.
Can you talk about everybody being in and if one opts out?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, so there've been a lot of questions about how it works with the FLOST, so that's the floating local option sales tax that's authorized under House Bill 581. And the way that works, in order for a county and the cities in that county to be able to participate in the FLOST, that both the county and every city in the county that levies a property tax need to have, in effect, a floating homestead exemption or freeze, either an existing local one or the House Bill 581 exemption. So Cobb County already has the freeze. You said most of the cities do.
All except Austell.
All except Austell. Then if Austell, since they don't have that float, if they were to opt out, it kills the FLOST for the entire county. So the county and the rest of the cities would not be able to use it.
Okay, so here are some implications that we kind of wanted to give you for Cobb County government. What happens if the county goes one way? What happens if the county goes another way? So in regards to Cobb County, if the county were to stay in the program, and in other words, not opt out, the general fund float remains the same. That doesn't change. The float stays in place. The fire fund would see less increase because the increase is tied to a number that is provided by the Revenue Commissioner, which we believe is going to be tied to CPI each year. Keep in mind that only homesteaded properties are capped. This does not apply to non-homesteaded properties, which would be rentals, vacant land, and any commercial property. Does not apply. If the county were to opt out, the general fund remains the same. That float, no change to that. The fire fund will have the normal increases that it has seen with the digest in the past. So we provided an example. Do we have that Excel sheet that we can show? That other file? We provided an example of just a sample property in the county and how it looks in 2024 and some of the changes that would occur in 2025 if the county were to stay in the program. We can kind of show you that. We showed this at the last meeting, and I think it kind of gives you a good idea of what things would look like. It'll be just a second. Maybe I'll go on to the next slide, just if you can let me know when you're ready, Ross. So here's a timeline sample. This is what, just kind of a way to look at things visually as far as how the timeline might work if you were to opt out. We talked about this a little bit earlier. If a decision would realistically need to be made in January, and then you would hold your public hearings in February, and then you would have your resolution delivered to the Secretary of State by March 1st. Just kind of a visual way to look at things. Now, at the assessor's office, things change a little bit for us. Many of you are familiar with the digest projection meeting that we often hold with your finance departments at the end of March. That will have to change a little bit because on March 1st, the authorities, all of you, are required to provide our office. Actually, the law says the tax commissioner's office, I believe. But we need that information for the assessment notice. So the tax commissioner's office and our office need to have an estimated rollback from each jurisdiction by March 1st. That's the data that's going on the assessment notice instead of the tax estimate, an estimated rollback number. May 1st, you are accustomed to providing my office with an estimated millage rate. That doesn't change. That's what we use to calculate the actual rollback rate. That number doesn't change. That date doesn't change. We'll still need you to provide the estimated millage rate to my office by May 1st. And then mid-June, you will be able to pick up your final digest and your rollback data as normal. So the two dots, the dot on the right, the dot in the center, those don't change. However, that is a big dot on the left. We will now be needing from each jurisdiction an estimated rollback. So that brings into question the digest projection meeting and when are we going to have that. We are working through that. We will try and have that earlier for you than you are accustomed so that you're able to make an educated decision by March 1st.
One comment I wanted to make, that the March 1st date is not in the current law, but it is something that's being requested by ACCG in the upcoming legislative session, and that's to provide certainty with that date and to make sure that the notice of assessment doesn't get delayed. So as long as that information comes from the local governments to the tax assessor's office timely, that shouldn't be an issue.
So we'll, sure. There we go, float sample. So this is just a property that I took out of the system just to kind of show how things might look and might affect the property. You'll notice up at the top, you've got the 2024 data. Could you just scale it back just a little bit, CP, so they can see the number on the right? Yeah, perfect, thank you. So in this property, the tax bill for last year, this is an unincorporated Cobb, was $5,900. The value that our office had on this property was $655,400 for 2024. This property was originally purchased. Can you just slide up just a little bit, CP? Just the other, there we go. Keep going. Oh, okay. You don't have it there. So the year one was 2004. There we go. 2004 is the base year. The fair market value was $143,200. In 2024, it is $655,400. Keeping in mind that 40% of the fair market value is the assessed number, I would direct your attention to the highlighted yellow number, $57,280. That is the general fund float. That's the taxable value for that property. And so in 2024, when you carry everything over, the total tax bill was $5,900. In 2025, just looking at the comparables in that neighborhood, and I'm just making an assumption, the value that we will have on that property is $700,000. So what were to happen, you'll see on the left there, if the county stays in, the property tax bill will be about $6,300. And that's because the float stays the same. The fire fund just goes up by a small percentage of what the CPI, I assumed 2.5, I just assumed a number. So the fire fund goes up very, very small, and this is assuming that the school opts out. That's what it would look like. Now, if you wanted to know, well, what would happen to this situation if the school were to stay in? If the school were to stay in the program, Cobb County School, the total tax bill would be about $6,100. So it's an increase of about $150 in the total tax bill. But we can give you this file if you'd like to see, plug in your own, play with it yourself, take a look at different properties in your jurisdiction, play with the millage rates and things like that, and you can kind of see how the property tax bill is affected. But just kind of wanted to give you a sample. Again, I'm happy to share this file with you, and you can kind of play with it as you like. This is the portion of the assessment notice that is going away. These two columns, the millage and the estimated tax and the total estimated tax, those, the two columns on the right and the total number at the bottom. We believe that it is going to, this box C will still be there. It's just you will not have the estimated tax, you will have an estimated rollback next to each fund.
Only on the M&O.
Correct, yes, yeah. Okay, so that is the information that we have. We hope that takes care of a number of questions that you may have. We're going to give you our contact information so that you can certainly contact us, but we're happy to answer any questions that you may have at this point, and if it has to do with the tax bill, we're happy to ask our tax commissioner to come up and address any of those questions. So whatever questions you have, we're certainly happy to entertain. Mr. Tanks. I think we have a mic that we can get over to you, Bill.
I noticed that the sales tax, the 2% cap, it was affected. I guess they revised it with this bill. If a FLOST is obviously one of those sales tax we're interested in, how is it affected? Was it exempted? Or how is that sales tax capped? I think we're at 6%, 2% local, 4% state. How does all this with the FLOST play into that? And was it affected by the new revision?
Yep, so that's a good question. So how does the FLOST play into that 2% cap? And the answer to that is that the FLOST is in its own bucket as one of the exempt sales tax. So you get to pull one from each of those exempt buckets, which is, and there are 3 of them, so that's how you get to a maximum local rate of 5. Given that Cobb's rate is currently at 2% local sales tax, y'all wouldn't have any issues levying that FLOST. It wouldn't hurt you with the cap. It's exempted.
So right now we have a SPLOST.
So SPLOST does apply against the cap. LOST applies against the cap, but FLOST is an exempted penny.
Okay, so it would not be restricted to the cap.
Right, correct. The FLOST? Yes, ma'am. So the FLOST is a new sales tax authorized under House Bill 581, created for the purpose of property tax relief. And the way that property tax relief shown is in 2 ways. So whatever is collected in the FLOST in the year before gets converted to a millage equivalent, and then your annual rollback rate is reduced by that millage equivalent. So it's helping to lower that millage rate. And the thinking there was that the floating homestead exemption is putting limits on the values for those homesteaded properties, which is shifting some tax burden to the other property types. And then the FLOST is helping reduce the overall M&O millage rate and is therefore providing property relief to all property types, including those ones that saw some increased burden in those areas that didn't already have a float or a freeze like Cobb does. Now, the other way it gets shown is on the tax bill. It shows how much the taxpayer saved on their individual piece of property because that FLOST was in effect. And then in order to levy the FLOST, again, you need to have the county and every city within the county that levies a property tax having a floating homestead exemption or freeze. And then you need an intergovernmental agreement that has the county and a city or cities making up more than 50% of the municipal population in cities that levy a property tax. You can have all cities sign on. That's absolutely allowed, but the minimum requirement is a city or cities representing more than half of that city population. Once you have that intergovernmental agreement signed, it can go to referendum to the voters. So they will have to have a separate vote on it countywide. And then those revenues from the FLOST will be distributed in accordance with that intergovernmental agreement. Yes, ma'am.
As to the separate vote. As to the separate vote, would that be just within the individual jurisdictions, or is that a vote by the constituents within the county?
It would be a countywide vote. Since it's a countywide sales tax and it's collected countywide, it would be a countywide vote.
So what if the constituents vote the FLOST down? Then what?
Well, then the FLOST doesn't go into effect. Y'all are able to put it back to referendum at a future date if that's what local governing authorities decide to do. But if they vote it down, then it doesn't go into effect.
And so then essentially the individual boards would then have to do a millage rate increase in order to continue to collect the amount of revenue that they had been.
I don't believe so.
Well, but if the FLOST is supposed to help subsidize the reduction in the millage rate, if the FLOST doesn't pass, you're going to have a millage increase to cover that revenue loss.
The FLOST is used to reduce that M&O rate to provide additional property tax relief, but the FLOST is not being used to make up the lost revenue by implementing a new float. So if you were levying the FLOST and then it did not get renewed, that would very likely result in a millage rate increase. But if you put the FLOST to referendum and it were voted down, I don't think that would automatically cause a millage increase. And Cobb County already has a freeze, which is more beneficial to the taxpayers, but also more restrictive than the float under House Bill 581. So I don't see y'all taking much of a loss on that.
If a FLOST is in effect, what happens, or are there any guidelines or restrictions for any surplus that's beyond the property tax assessments and the collections?
So as of right now, the law is generally silent on it. It does say that the FLOST funds need to be used exclusively for property tax relief, and that is largely in the form of a millage rollback. And so if you don't have property tax to offset, that it's an outstanding question.
Okay. And on that, based on the, you said it was a millage rate rollback, so that's over and above whatever base your homestead is in place for each jurisdiction, correct? It's not to replace that revenue, it's to basically increase rollback above and beyond. Is that correct?
Correct. It's not to increase revenue, it's to provide additional property tax relief above and beyond the float.
Can the FLOST homestead be transferred to a new home?
So the floating homestead exemption, I guess, is separate from the FLOST. So anytime, are you asking if the taxpayer moves, if it can be transferred?
Yes.
No, it cannot. So it stays with that taxpayer in the home that they're living in, and then whenever that home is transferred or sold, that new owner would have to come in and apply for a homestead exemption themselves. But you can't take it with you.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, one more odd question. Do we know the general costs for the implementation of the stuff yet, or is that something that is to be estimated later? For trying to implement the requirements of 581, whether it, I know for Marietta, for example, we have the frozen homestead across, so the only thing we'd have to do is just constantly show that ours is better than 581. So just not sure if there's any cost to that, whether it's to the county or the city for that.
So I believe the question has to do with cost to the county on the administrative side, right?
Yes, that could be one way to view it.
The cost that the county will incur, we share the database that we have, the system that does all the calculating and processing of bills and assessment notices with the tax commissioner's office. We are just one county of several that vendor works with. They are working with all counties who are using them to develop the new assessment notice and the program. We share that cost with them. So it's a benefit to us because we don't have to pay all of that programming cost. It's being deployed to every county that has the same system. We do not have that estimate as of yet. We did this back in 2010, I think it was, with Senate Bill 346 when we started the assessment notice. And I do not anticipate that cost because we share with so many counties. I believe there's 12 counties, I think, that we're sharing the cost with, something like that. I think it's going to be very manageable in regards to how much money will this cost Cobb County to put this program into place. I think it's manageable, but I don't have that number as of yet. We haven't received that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? We have some, on our final slide here, I will give you my email address, Dante email address, our tax commissioner's email address, and Ross has done a great job in putting some information together in our communications department link. There's a lot of information there. I believe there's some information on the ACCG website. There was a webinar that you can download. But we will be here for a little while. We are happy to talk with you as long as you would like, answer any questions that you may have. Commissioner.
I do want to address something.
Oh, maybe.
So for the rollback. Wait, here we go. For the rollback rate, which we talked about in previous meetings, that's going to be noted on the tax bill, correct?
The estimated rollback will be on the assessment notice.
Okay, on the assessment notice. But my concern is there's going to be an expectation of there being a rollback. So how do we balance that expectation? Because if you constantly see the rollback rate, at some point, the homeowners will have an expectation of that rollback rate. And I'm just trying to avoid any appearances of a lack of transparency or any misconceptions moving forward that we are guaranteeing a rollback rate.
I think that's on.
So, and let me know if this doesn't answer your question, but thinking about it, you have the traditional rollback rate that's been in effect all these years that y'all are familiar with, and that remains completely unchanged by House Bill 581. Then there's this new concept, which is an estimated rollback rate. And so since the estimate in the bottom right-hand corner, the notice of assessment came off, that number was using the updated value, but last year's millage, which was assuming zero rollback, which means it was almost always on the high side in a lot of the counties throughout the state. This estimated rollback is allowing y'all as local governments to estimate a number to the public early in that process that should be more accurate than just using last year's millage. And assuming any growth in your digest, the rollback number will be lower than last year's millage rate. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
And I just may need to be educated on this recent bill where no longer you have to report a tax increase if it's just based on a property value increase. If in this event someone does collect the FLOST dollars and it's not enough in sales tax to roll back a decent amount of the assessed property value, or would the cities and counties still be required to report a tax increase?
The answer to that is yes, they would. Yep.
Good morning. I'm Carla Jackson, Tax Commissioner. And Commissioner, I think this may be what you were talking to. If in fact the adopted millage rate does exceed that estimate, it is required to be printed on the tax bill in bold letters that you are, that basically they have a tax increase. So that will be required to be included on all tax bills.
I'll ask one. Hi, this is Representative David Wilkerson. Is this a new term, rollback? Because historically, rollback has been whatever your current tax is, the assessment goes up. If you don't cut the taxes back, you have to roll it back to a certain dollar amount to keep you even. But now on this notice, is the rollback rate really going to be whatever you guys determine that rollback rate is, not the actual calculation? Does that make sense? So if you think you're going to be at 7.2 mils, you could technically put on there 7.3 mils because you kind of make up that rollback rate on this notice and then come back and do 7.2. Is that correct?
So the local governments do have broad authority to set this estimated rollback rate at whichever number they deem appropriate. But the intent is to get as close to that true rollback as they can. The traditional rollback rate that you were talking about remains unchanged by this bill. And so if a local government were to do that and that number came out to 7.2 for the traditional rollback rate, and the local government didn't roll all the way back to 7.2, they would have to advertise that as a tax increase to the public, same as they've had to do historically.
Correct, but a follow-up. The estimated rollback rate is 7.2. They continue to hold their hearings as they have already. However, when they send the assessment notice out there, they can put on their 7.4 because they don't have to put the calculated rollback rate. Is that correct? They can put whatever number on there that they deem reasonable.
Yeah, that's true. They can set whatever number. I guess I would say that true rollback rate, since all the values are still being updated, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Steve, but since those values are still being updated, the local government may not have all the information that they need to fully calculate that true rollback rate at that point in time, which is why it is an estimate.
And while I know no one from the school board is here, can we talk a little bit about how this affects if the school opts in or opts out? Because I know in the discussion we had before, I think it was in October, it was told that depending on which way they opted, if they had to go against the 20 mil cap that is currently set on them, that it would have to go out for a referendum. Could you kind of explain so our viewers can understand how this could impact the school and why they might decide to opt in or opt out?
Yep. So, like the counties and the cities, the school gets to make an independent decision whether or not they want to stay in under House Bill 581 or opt out. As of January 1st, they are automatically in unless they opt out. So my understanding is that the Cobb County schools do not have a float. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. So if they choose not to opt out, so they're staying in, then they would have that floating homestead exemption applied to all their millage rates, which means that the taxable value would only increase for those homeowners by up to whatever that inflationary metric set by the Department of Revenue is, probably CPI. So let's say that the home jumped 20% in value, but CPI was 3%. That taxpayer's taxable value for their school bill only increases by 3%. Now, it does not matter if the school stays in or opts out for purposes of FLOST. So because they're unable to share in the revenues absent a future constitutional amendment, it doesn't affect the FLOST whether they stay in or opt out. And then if the school opts out, then that protection for those homeowners to limit the increase to CPI goes away, and it continues operating under the current system.
Go ahead.
However, depending if they opt in or opt out, because we know, again, there's a 20 mil cap that the schools can collect. We know ours is sitting at 18.91. So if they opted in and took the float, what steps would they have to do if they had to go above 20 mils to collect the revenue that they currently are generating?
Gotcha. Yeah, I apologize for not answering that part of your question. So if the schools wanted to exceed that 20 mil cap, they need to put it to a countywide referendum. So asking the voters for permission to exceed 20. And if that vote is voted in the affirmative, then they're able to go above 20, and if it's not, then they can't.
When you say we are frozen, in order, our current Floating Homestead Act is not capped, but it's a greater percentage than what we would have to go to. So if we would still have to opt out and go through the process to keep our current 40% floating homestead, or no?
So realistically, and maybe we'll go back to the one slide, I think this, if Cobb County stays in the program, the float stays as it is. The homestead float that we have for the general fund stays as it is, and the fire fund would see less increase than it has in the past, because it would be capped at the increase that the revenue commissioner, the assessments would be capped at the number that the revenue commissioner sets. I'm sorry?
I agree with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's what would happen if Cobb County government stayed in. If they opted out, then the float stays the same, because that's enabling legislation, been in place for a long time. It's to the advantage of the taxpayer because the value is frozen. The assessed value, the taxable value is frozen. No matter what, the assessed value, the taxable value is frozen no matter what Cobb County government does. Realistically, for Cobb County government, this is a decision on the fire fund.
Okay.
It's okay. So there are two different decision points that I'm perceiving. One is whether or not we opt in or opt out with respect to the homestead exemption. And then the other one is with respect to FLOST.
So you're already in, as of January 1, you make a decision to opt out. In other words, if
Yes.
the jurisdiction does nothing, then you're in. And I believe that you are correct, that there's two decisions. One has to do with opting out.
Opting out.
The other one has to do with the FLOST, you're right.
Okay.
On the homestead float? Right there. The resolution has to be filed by March 1st. So you kind of work backwards from there. You got to hold 3 public hearings, similar to the way that the county holds public hearings now for the millage. And so, you make a decision before that, in essence.
Yes, and that's what I'm seeking guidance on and working backwards from that March 1st date, is if we decide to, let's say, opt out, or if we make that decision point with respect to the floating homestead exemption or sales tax, floating sales tax, are there rules guiding how we conduct those meetings, when we conduct those meetings? And I'm saying that because we're almost at the end of the year, and March 1st will be here in no time, and we would have to make decisions very quickly. In fact, with respect to the FLOST, that requires a joint decision amongst all of our jurisdictions. I think we would want to coordinate to ensure that the meetings were happening within a certain amount of time so we can meet that March 1st date. And I'm just a little concerned about the exigence and us making sure that we're addressing that.
So I'm thinking about it. The rules for holding those public hearings are the same as it is for that notification of tax increase. So if y'all didn't do a full rollback, the way you'd advertise and hold those 3 meetings is the same way that you would advertise and hold these 3 meetings. Then the other requirement is that you adopt a resolution and file that with the Secretary of State by March 1st. So it is a tight turnaround time. The original version of this idea that came out of the Senate was a mandate on all local governments. The compromise that came out of the House was that it would automatically apply, but there was the ability to opt out. And so to keep that window tight and I guess make sure that decision was timely, that's why it's such a quick turnaround. So it is definitely good for y'all to be thinking about what you want to do in early January, and it's coming up quick. As far as the FLOST goes, the most likely timeline for that referendum is November. I think it is also possible to put it to referendum in March, but I guess that depends on how quickly y'all could get that intergovernmental agreement signed. But those would be the 2 dates. I think it's March 18th and then whatever the November date is next year. Right, and then if you were to put FLOST to referendum next November, the collections would begin January 1st of 2026. And then you'd start showing those rollbacks on the millage in 2027.
So there's more time for us to consider that FLOST.
Absolutely, there is.
Critical thing for us to determine right now is whether or not we're going to opt out.
That's right, because this decision to opt out is a one-time decision to opt out. There's no ability to opt out in the future after that March 1st date. It's a one-time shot. And then if a local government did opt out, it is possible to later get back in through a local act, but this opt-out is a one-time decision.
So say the county opts out, but our cities opt in. Are they able to do the FLOST?
Yep, so as long as the county and every city that levies a property tax have a float, y'all are able to do the FLOST. Cobb County already has a qualifying float. So if y'all opt out of the House Bill 581 exemption, Cobb still meets its requirement. And then it's a matter of whether or not every city that levies a property tax has a float. Was it Austell that doesn't?
Correct.
Right, so it depends what Austell does there. If Austell opts out, since they levy a property tax, that kills the FLOST for everyone.
But what about, because you said it also, they needed to represent 50% of the constituents within the county.
So-
What if they don't meet that criteria?
So the signatories to the IGA need to make up at least half of the municipal population within those cities that levy a property tax. But if there's any city that levies a property tax and does not have a floating homestead exemption, that's a prerequisite to levy the FLOST, and so that's what kills it. Doesn't matter how large or small the city is.
So, Dante, hey, Michael McPherson with GMA. Just to say it another way, if Cobb decided to opt out, they still qualify for the FLOST. It would be up to the cities as to whether or not they would qualify. And if anyone opts out, the county and the cities do not qualify for the FLOST until that city or cities decided to go into a homestead that qualifies.
Yeah, they could regain eligibility that way. I mean, for Cobb County and all the cities in Cobb that already have a floating homestead exemption, if Cobb and those cities opt out, that local homestead exemption that you already have still counts and qualifies. So you're able to opt out and still retain eligibility for FLOST. And thank you, Michael.
For clarity, can you opt in, stay in, and opt out of the FLOST, a municipality? Are you bound to stay into the FLOST?
So if you stay in, you don't have to do the FLOST, as in the county and all the cities don't have to sign that intergovernmental agreement and put it to referendum. But if the county and a city or cities representing more than 50% of that municipal population do come together on that intergovernmental agreement, whether your city signs on or not, the FLOST still moves forward to referendum. If it passes, it'll be levied countywide. Yep. So staying in the House Bill 581 floating homestead exemption doesn't force you to do a FLOST. If the county and the requisite amount of the cities participate in that intergovernmental agreement, then the FLOST goes to referendum. If the voters pass it, then the FLOST will take effect. Any city that's less than that 50% that doesn't sign on to the IGA, and again, every city can sign on to the intergovernmental agreement, but if for some reason your city does not, then that city gets a population share out of the city portion negotiated by the other cities. So you would compare your city's population to the total municipal population, and then you would get that percentage from the city share.
I don't know if you can get in the brain of legislators, but what was the incentive of that decision? I think he asked the right question. A city is not involved in IGA and they still benefit. What was the motive? What was the thinking behind that?
So the intent of the FLOST is to provide property tax relief. This was to make sure that you don't have a small city cut out of the process and completely excluded from those from the benefits of the FLOST. This way there's still some rollback being provided to that city and its residents, even though it's not a significant part of the population or not a majority of the population.
Even if they're not in IGA, let's say they don't, big city doesn't, if a big city does not participate in IGA, they still benefit. Was that just an oversight?
So I guess it depends how big the city is. If the city represents more than half of the municipal population, then they have to be a signatory to that IGA. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they would absolutely have to sign, otherwise it wouldn't move forward.
Any other questions?
I have one, Dante.
Yes, sir.
So if I'm a resident out here watching this, we're talking through the lens of the county and the cities. My head's exploded already at this point. What was the referendum designed to do? How was it designed to help me as a homeowner? And what should I be watching out for here in the weeks ahead?
Mm-hmm. So the referendum was designed to help you as a homeowner by providing some predictability. In this case, I'm imagining that the Department of Revenue Commissioner is going to pick one of those CPI figures. So it lets you know with certainty that your taxable value won't increase by more than that inflation number in any given year. Now, this is pushed forth statewide to try and help address issues throughout the state. Cobb County is already offering an exemption more generous than the House Bill 581 floating homestead exemption, as are most of the cities in Cobb County. So it doesn't impact Cobb as much as it does areas that have not had floating homestead exemptions. I think throughout the state, there are only about 30 to 35 counties and cities that do have an existing float or freeze. So it's going to have a larger impact on those other areas. For Cobb County, countywide, the decision is whether or not to apply the House Bill 581 floating homestead exemption to the fire fund. And that's the main effect. So if Cobb opts out, then the fire fund doesn't have that inflationary protection on it. If Cobb stays in, then it gains that new protection for those homeowners that was not previously in place.
So to continue on the homeowner's perspective, if the county opts in or opts out, how does that affect assessments? So no matter if you opt in or opt out, are you capped at whatever the tax, I think you said the sales tax revenue commissioner determines, or does the county and the whoever does for the municipalities continue to determine what your assessment is, and it's not capped at that, say, 3% increase?
Yeah, that's a great question. My office is still responsible for placing the fair market value on all properties. That does not change. So that'll be the first number on the assessment notice. What we feel your home can be sold for on January 1. That doesn't change. The taxable number does change. And so if, in regards to Cobb County government, the float, that program, as you saw in the slides, that's not changing at all. No matter what Cobb County government do, that will not change. But the fire fund number, the taxable number, the final number, that would go up only by what the revenue commissioner, the percentage that the revenue commissioner decides if the county stays in. If the county opts out, then it's just like it is right now. It would go up according to the total fair market value.
So as far as the county general fund amount, that will not change if we opt in or opt out?
Does not change, correct.
Thank you.
I also just wanted to make one other statement that I thought was relevant based on a comment. For jurisdictions making this decision, it's important to also remember this decision is forever. So any future levies that you may decide you want to impose, it would be tied to that. So you can't have a general fund that's part of the House Bill 581 program, but you don't want it on other line items. It's a decision forever, correct?
Yeah, it applies across the board to all levies except for bond levies. So that's why it would capture Cobb's fire fund as a special district.
The question was asked what the intent was by the legislature. I can tell you that there was a lot of conversation regarding people's taxes going up purely because the values went up. And so the intent was to pass a constitutional amendment to say that won't happen in the future. We're going to cap it at a CPI. The second piece of that is how do you actually implement it? And so that came later. So the discussion we're having here, when you get negotiations between the House and Senate, things differently change. So when we voted on it in the House, that was probably the first time many of us saw the final bill that implements it. So that's why we didn't come back to everybody and say this is what it looks like, because we didn't even see it. As far as a taxpayer is concerned, if you live in every city, except for, as he said, Austell or Mableton, you won't see a change whether you opt in or opt out, except for fire. As far as a taxpayer, when you get your bill, you will see a change because now you'll just see a value and not an estimated dollar amount. And so that's probably the biggest change for a taxpayer is that at the beginning of the year, they're going to say, oh, my taxes went up by $1,000. They won't see that until they get their actual bill. As a tax commission will tell you that typically people will appeal their value when they get that assessment because they know the taxes are going up, but now they won't be able to do that. So that's probably the biggest change. And as far as, if you could just answer this one question, as far as the FLOST, back to the chairwoman's question earlier, there is a timeline as far as opting in or opting out. But as far as levying that additional sales tax, is there a timeline for that, or they can do it in the future based on how they see things shaking out?
Yep, so that's a good question. There's no cutoff date to implement the FLOST that first time. So in an odd year, so in 2025, there are only 2 dates that the FLOST would be eligible to go to referendum, and that's the March date and the November date. It's different in even years. But the county and the cities could certainly hold off and choose to do it down the line. Any renewal of the FLOST requires a local act by the local delegation. So all the renewals have that check and balance on them, but the first time can be called whenever the local governments deem appropriate.
Okay, and just following up on the thing about the I think for the county it was the fire, so that's for unincorporated residents and those in the city that are part of the fire district. Those outside the fire district, like City of Marietta, ours are already frozen, I believe, so there wouldn't be a change regardless of whether there's an opt-in or opt-out outside of the school system, I believe. The City of Marietta has its own fire departments. It's on our general millage, so it's already frozen.
That's correct. The float that you have in City of Marietta applies to all your line items on your bill, so you're correct. That would not apply.
As to the FLOST, yes, it has to go for a referendum, but what is the time period that the FLOST remains effective? And then depending on the cities, if they opt in or opt out, if there is a time period on the FLOST, when would that municipality be able to essentially join in the collection of the FLOST funds?
So the FLOST can be put to referendum to run for up to 5 years at any given time. Then all renewals, again, will need a local act to the General Assembly. I would think that you need to meet those prerequisites, so your city needs to be levying a property tax and have a floating homestead exemption at the time that FLOST IGA is signed and then the referendum is called. So I would think that if the city's not levying a property tax and FLOST goes to referendum and passes, that if the city later meets those prerequisites, they would need to wait for the renewal. That's my opinion on that.
And then the renewal would be based on whatever was determined by those that wanted to share in the collection of the FLOST.
So that the renewal, yes, will require an updated intergovernmental agreement. So that would specify how those funds would be distributed. And then it will require a local act enabling that referendum to renew the FLOST.
So who would be responsible to going to the legislation to ask for that to be approved? Or would it be just a joint agreement between all the cities and municipalities, or can individual municipalities go? So
I think I understand your question. So in order to get the FLOST renewed, in order to put it to referendum for the renewal, everything starts with another updated intergovernmental agreement. So the county and the requisite number of cities would have to come together and get that intergovernmental agreement signed, and then you all would reach out to your local legislators, so Representative Wilkerson and the rest of the Cobb delegation, and request that.
I think we're done.
I think we're done. If there are no additional questions, thank you all for being here. Please note again, Dante and Steven said they would be available if you have any additional questions. And I look forward to us determining how we'll move forward, hopefully sometime early next year. Thank you. And happy